Is the state of New York going to secede as a result of President-elect Trump's deportation program? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principal case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again post-Thanksgiving.
It's good to be with you and our viewers and listeners, and I hope that all of them had a delightful Thanksgiving.
Yeah, my sentiments exactly. By the way, before we get started, we're getting ready to send out our end-of-year fundraising letters. I hope y'all will give us your positive consideration. Y'all have kept us going for 34, 35 years now, and we couldn't do it without your support. And I hope that you'll consider us in your generous giving situation here at the end of the year. Okay, Richard, we had a rather humorous incident occurring in the state of New York. There's a state senator there, I think her name is Liz Krueger or something like that, that is threatening secession because she's upset over President-elect Trump's plan to deport illegal immigrants, or his mass deportation plan. She's upset that he's threatening to cut off federal funds to New York. And so she suggested the possibility that maybe New York, along with other states in the Northeast, just secede from the United States and become part of Canada, become a southern province of Canada. Well, this stirred up a firestorm, as you can imagine, that, telling this lady, well, if you don't like it here, why don't you just go to Canada yourself? And one person offered her a one-way Amtrak ticket. And the noted legal scholar Jonathan Turley posted, I think it was on X, a picture of Lee surrendering to Grant at Appomattox, saying that she isn't the first person to be thinking outside the box. But of course, it does raise the question, and I don't think Turley addresses the question of, well, what's wrong with secession? Okay, so Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it was right. I mean, might doesn't necessarily make right. The North won the Civil War. There's no question about the fact that Lincoln initiated the war to prevent secession, not to free the slaves, as is the common myth. That was not his objective in the beginning. It was to simply to prevent secession. But the fact that the North ends up winning doesn't make it right in a moral sense. It also doesn't make it right in a legal or constitutional sense. And my question really is if people don't want to associate with other people, why should they be forced to? And if this was such an important thing to prohibit, why wouldn't the framers have included in the Constitution that says if you join this union, you can never leave? Well, seems to me that if people want to leave, they ought to be able to leave. Now, I don't know how you would establish the numbers or the percentage of votes in a particular state. Would it require a 75% vote to secede or a 90% vote? Because clearly, once that number is reached, there's going to be the minority that doesn't want secession that is going to be seceded anyway. So I think it's an interesting question. Obviously, it's not a real practical question. It's not going to happen anytime soon. But I think it's worth asking. Why shouldn't people be free to secede that don't want to have anything to do with other people? What do you think?
Well, I think the central corner piece of the argument is the right of freedom of association. We recognize in principle, though of course now politically we don't always practice it, but we recognize in principle the right of freedom of association. You marry whom you want, you have friends whom you want, you enter into contracts and exchanges and business dealings with those with whom you want on agreed upon terms of association. obviously of different forms of that agreement of association inside and outside of the marketplace, but it's the same logic. And the idea that people should be able to choose the political authority under which they want to live is reasonable too. Now, the model that I would propose for implementing this, and one that I've actually written about a few times concerning a number of international cases, is the one that was proposed by the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, and that is the right of individual self-determination in the following sense. He proposed, and he was talking about a number of European countries that had multiple ethnic and racial groups in which there were animosities. A minority group didn't want to live under a majority of another group and so on. But he proposed that there should be regional and local plebiscites where every district, every large municipal area, every province, if you will, administrative unit within a country should have a vote. For example, if I can use the example of Crimea, which began this whole Russian-Ukrainian war back in 2014, following Mises's proposal, I said, look here, the Crimea has three ethnic groups, Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers, and a smaller minority of Tatars, who often basically are Muslim. The Russians are the largest group, but there are large minorities of Ukrainians and Tatars. And they're sprinkled around the Crimean Peninsula in non-uniform ways, not contiguous territories. So following Mises's rule, the idea would be just hold these town or regional votes, district votes, plebiscites, and admittedly has to decide, is it going to be a majority? Will it be 2/3? But if a majority wishes to secede, either to join a different state, let's suppose the Ukrainians in the Crimea wanted to stay part of Ukraine, or those parts of Crimea where the Russians are the majority and they voted in their regions, their districts, their towns to join Russia. And then if the Tatars didn't want to belong to either one, but wanted to have their own independent country, it would look like a checkerboard, but you would just do it that way. And if there's relative freedom of movement and freedom of trade, especially, that reduces the antagonisms, the preserved degrees of commonly benefiting division of labor among those parts. And if I can just say, after Brexit in the United Kingdom, I wrote a piece in which I again applied Mises's argument. I said, well, it turns out that a majority in England and in Wales voted to leave the European Union, but that both Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to stay as part of the European Union. And in fact, the greater London area also voted to stay part of the European Union. And the Scots were so upset about this that they were threatening to secede from the United Kingdom. Fine, have a plebiscite. Those countries that Scotland wants to be independent and to stay part of the European Union, have a plebiscite. And if at the same time, if there's certain districts or parts of large townships of Scotland that would prefer to remain part of the UK outside of the EU, they could then still remain part of this now smaller UK England. But let Scotland go, let Northern Ireland go. That would be a solution to a lot of the Northern Ireland problems. Old plebiscites in the border areas with the Republic of Ireland are heavily majority Catholic, and they probably would choose to join the Irish Republic, while the heavily Protestant parts around Belfast would want to stay part of the UK. Let the people choose this. And that would solve the problem. If London wants to secede from the rest of England and stay part of the European Union, well, England gets a new capital city somewhere. Who cares? So following that model, and Mises is quite serious about this, when talking about these matters in the multi-ethnic and multi-linguistic areas of Central and Eastern Europe of the period between the wars when he was writing these things, just do this in the United States. If hold a plebiscite in New York State, in counties, right? That would be the most convenient way, and counties at the county levels. Now, I would project the following, forecast the following. A good part of northern New York State tends to vote heavily Republican. The Democratic vote is most heavily in Albany, I guess Buffalo, and certainly New York City. Well, they might vote to secede. Well, the county that Albany is in, the boroughs of New York City, if Buffalo would wanted to secede, great. They can now appeal to the government of Canada to be part of Canada, and the rest of New York would stay part of the United States. You could do the same thing. This woman who we refer to, the state senator in New York, she proposed Vermont, Massachusetts, and I think Connecticut have votes the same way. Those parts of these states that want to secede, either to become an independent country or to join Canada if Canada wanted to accept them, feel free. Those parts that wanted to stay part of the United States, they do so too. Now, you might say, but in each county, there would still be people who had voted the opposite way. Well, yes. Unfortunately, there cannot be a perfect solution unless each individual could literally, as an individual, choose what political authority they wanted to be under. But at least you would reduce the animosity. The majority in, let's say, Albany County would no longer have to be under a federal government managed by Donald Trump, which is really what this is all about. And New York City would be the same. Now, there are people in Albany and New York who would prefer to remain part of the United States. And that's a misfortune, but at least the majority, a 2/3 vote, let's say, would have their way. And again, as long as trade and movement remain relatively free or completely free, obviously, from a classical liberal point of view, the tensions, the animosities, the discomforts, the breakdown of economic opportunities would be either not existing or at least would be minimized. And that's how you could hold this. Just do plebiscites, and then that diffuses the political tension. You want to be an independent country? Be an independent country. You want to stay in the country you are? Fine. You want to appeal to another country to annex you and to be a province of their country? And that would be the solution. That at least diffuses a lot of the politics. And then it would be really interesting to see, if you did hold such a vote, as to whether even majorities of the people in Albany and New York City would really want to leave the United States. But then it's the people's choice, an imperfect thing. Political decision-making with majoritarianism is always less perfect than the marketplace, where individuals get to make their own individual choices. As I often use the example, we're all a whole bunch of us are in the supermarket. We have our own carts going down the corridors, and each of us picks off the shelves the items we want in the combinations that are most optimal to ourselves, and that's what we go to the checkout stand with. Each individual can make his own choices in the marketplace and can change them every day in principle. Unlike the political arena, where you only get to hold periodic elections, and if you want to change in policy, you have to persuade the voting majority to go along with you. So it's an imperfect version of democratic pluralism of the marketplace, but it's the way politics obviously has historically operated under some form of democracy. But at least that's how a policy of secession could work, with minimizing the inconveniences of those who wanted to vote the other way.
Okay, well, listening to your analysis there, I can understand how a large geographic area could pull off a secession, like the entire northern half of New York or the entire state of New York, and become a contiguous part of Canada. But it seems to me that if you start going down to the county level, that you could have a county in the middle of New York State joining Canada, and immediately the rest of New York erects immigration walls and tariffs and travel restrictions around that county.
Right.
How would that work? How would people get out?
Well, I would remind you that the United States is not contiguous with Alaska. Okay. Switzerland is surrounded by other countries, any one or combination of which could place severe barriers on Switzerland. Andorra is a little country between France and Spain with no exits to the rest of the world in the middle of the Pyrenees Mountains. Nepal is a little country between Chinese-controlled Tibet and India. There are areas of varying size which find themselves in this situation, and there can be tensions and difficulties. But at least if it was a matter of deciding which political entity you wanted to belong to, the Mises model of plebiscites is a way to diffuse the tensions, minimize the angers and animosities, a diminishment of the politicization of a tense issue, and just try to arrange that once these decisions are made, that freedom of movement and freedom of trade is, if not perfectly, at least maintained as best as one can to diffuse those negative effects. See, this is the problem with Brexit. Uh, because of the majority in England and Wales, who had more votes than as a whole than in London and Scotland and Northern Ireland, all of Britain moved out of Brexit. Now, that's fine. Who cares? But neither Great Britain nor the rest of the EU has followed a free trade policy. Great Britain could have said, we don't care what the EU does. We're now following free trade, which is not a fully EU policy to begin with. Or the EU said, we don't care that Britain's leaving. We're going to still let them trade on the same basis as the member states trade, which is not free trade, but more free trade than the existing trade barriers now between the EU and Britain. But neither country wanted to do that. So you pay a price. There are costs and the benefits. But I mean, Britain made its choice. There are now trade barriers that hadn't been there before, but you try to minimize those inconveniences and economic costs.
Well, if we go back to the Civil War, I've always felt that the North should have just let the South secede and then become a haven for escaping slaves. That you could have had an underground railroad saying that any black that escapes the South will find sanctuary in the North, and we will not return them. And slavery was dying of its own weight anyway. But as more and more slaves were escaping, especially like over a 4-year period of time the Civil War took, it would have broken the back of slavery. And without all of the massive death and destruction that the Civil War entailed, seems to me that that would have been a much better solution to freeing the slaves if that was your goal. And again, that was not Lincoln's original goal. That was his afterthought after he had sacrificed some 800, 900,000 people, that he realized that, hey, this huge death toll, it's kind of hard to justify over a political goal of preventing secession. So he says, I better free the slaves so that it'll look like more of a moral justification for all this death and destruction. I think it might have been better off letting them go and then just having the North serve as a sanctuary.
Yeah, it would have still been see the state governments wanted to secede. There were no plebiscites in these states. It's not as if South Carolina, which was the first state to secede in December of 1860, had held a plebiscite. And it's worth pointing out that at that time in South Carolina and I believe Alabama, which also became a part of the Southern Confederacy, the majority were blacks, slaves, but blacks. And obviously the majority did not have a say in whether they wanted to secede or not, because majorities, at least in those two Southern states, were not recognized even as a free person, let alone as a citizen with the right to vote. So it would have been a very imperfect solution, because basically it was white supremacy states that were seceding. But it obviously would have resulted in 600, 700,000 fewer deaths in the United States. That's usually the estimate I see in the history books about the death toll during the Civil War. Not to even mention all of those who were permanently injured, the generation of veterans who were permanently disabled, or having the psychological effects of it, which wasn't talked about much back then, but is now, of course, analyzed. And one could easily imagine that Lincoln could have said that fine, they secede. There is the Confederacy. We may or may not choose to have diplomatic relations with them. That's a different matter. But that our border is open to refugee escaping slaves. Obviously, the slaves had been escaping from the South, not in massive numbers because of the border controls of the southern states, but there was what we all learned in school, the Underground Railroad. I lived in Michigan before moving to South Carolina, and not far from where I was living when I was then teaching in Hillsdale College, there were homes that were still historically saved, as landmark places that had been places where runaway slaves had been hidden on their way to getting them smuggled into Canada where they would have been recognized as free citizens and not subject to return to the slave masters, obviously. So that could have been the way. And then if you just say all runaway slaves are welcome, either to stay in the United States or travel on to Canada, um, that would have put a huge pressure on the South. Uh, because the South, well, this would be a whole different thing, but let me just mention, the South was far behind either the North and the emerging Western states. If you look at the immigration figures from the first half of the 19th century and then into the rest of the 19th century, that is before and after the Civil War, we had these waves of millions of immigrants. If you look at the census figures, the result is that virtually none of these immigrants went to the southern states, that is the slave states. They all entered and then stayed and moved into free states in the North or the West. Jobs, markets, competition, a growing economy. The South had none of that. They virtually had no railroads. Therefore, you had to ride a horse or in a stagecoach or a wagon, rutted roads that weren't repaired or maintained. The South was primitive and backward because of the heavy burden of this anti-economic slave system that benefited, admittedly, some slave plantation owners, but not the rest of the South, even if many Southerners supported it because of their racist views. So, I mean, it would have slowly died. And I'll just mention one other fact about this, because I'm sure some viewers and listeners say, but Thomas Sowell, famous free market economist, now 96 years old, one of his early books was on race and economics. And he talked briefly about the South in that book. And he said that because of the rigidity of the slave system, slowly but surely commercial enterprises and commercial ways of doing things were seeping into the southern states. And that slavery as an institution was incompatible with the diversity, the decentralization, the spirit of innovation for profit making. That was it was anathema to the slave mentality, and that slowly but surely slavery would have had a natural death because of the superiority of the emerging market forces in the southern states as well. It wouldn't have been as dramatic and as soon as the Civil War in the 1860s. It might have gone on for another 10 years, 20 years before it was fully over. But even Thomas Sowell, a Black economist himself, believes that slavery was going to die a natural death in the South. But that's just a side issue in response to some people who would say, but you needed the Civil War to end slavery. But the thing is that would have been a solution. Just have it, allow it its natural death, continue to hold your nose for an institution was obviously repugnant to any person who believes in liberty, and diffuse a situation that tore the country apart for 4 years, caused massive life and destruction, and from which the United States still is not fully recovered.
Well, let's go back to the original cause of this controversy. It obviously is Trump's deportation plan, where he's promising to ferret out and deport 12 or 13 million estimated illegal immigrants here in the United States. This state senator, Liz Kruger, is all upset because he's threatening to cut off federal funds, the dole, to the state of New York if they don't cooperate or they become a so-called sanctuary for illegal immigrants. And you mentioned earlier freedom of association, which is a fundamental God-given right. I think everybody would acknowledge that, but except in the area of immigration, that these 12 or 13 million people that he's going to ferret out and deport are presumably very happy where they are, associating with people that they work for. And presumably the employers are happy with them, associating with them as employers, employees, people that they're renting from. I mean, they're obviously living and dwelling, most likely by renting housing. The landlord appears to be happy. You don't see any complaints there. Same thing with respect to the immigrant. So this plan, or actually immigration controls in general, this is what a lot of American advocates of immigration controls don't realize or don't want to realize, is that it is really an attack on our own freedom. And a basic aspect of that is freedom of association. But this guy that he's appointed to be director of immigration and customs enforcement, whose job it will be to ferret out and deport all these 12 or 13 illegal immigrants, a guy named Tom Homan, I mean, he comes across as a brutal and ruthless guy. And in response to what's, the situation in New York, he said that he's gonna go forth with this deportation plan and that nobody better interfere with it. And he said that if anybody interferes, there's going to be consequences. Well, that sounds like something you'd get out of a authoritarian, totalitarian regime. Like, what are the consequences he's talking about? Arrest, torture, uh, execution. I mean, it just sounds pretty ominous that don't you dare interfere with our massive plan here to ferret out and deport illegal immigrants, or you will suffer consequences. It seems pretty ominous to me, Richard.
Uh, I I had the same impression when I heard him with these snippets of that particular statement before the press, basically saying, get out of the way or be crushed under the federal bulldozer that will just knock everything down to seize and deport those that the federal government defines, that is, the executive branch defines, as undesirables, illegals, and threats to what Trump and his associates consider threats to social peace and national security. And notice that this becomes extremely arbitrary. Um, who defines who's undesirable? Who defines who's a social threat? Who defines what's a national security concern? And it's basically being those that Trump assigns these tasks. Now, I would expect um, that there'll be a wide variety of court cases attempting to have injunctions against this. Several of Trump's attempts in his first administration, following his election in 2016, resulted in state level court cases that resisted or prevented or slowed down some of the things that he wanted to do that particularly Democratic majority states did not want to abide by. And I should mention that when during his first term, there were people who said, well, if he were to be reelected in 2020, maybe California should secede from the union. I mean, it's a common thing among Democrats that they like to secede from the union. It seems to be a historical thing that they always take this attitude. But when they don't like something that the federal government does. But I yeah, if someone stands in front of federal agents, they run the risk of being arrested. But I could easily see state level attorney generals going to court to say that this is unconstitutional or illegal, or it's not passed a legislative act from Congress. This is an overreach of executive authority, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I imagine that there'd be a wide variety of court cases and a variety of injunctions. And in fact, the press has always reported that attorneys generals in these resisting states are all forming coalitions to do this as joint efforts even before Trump has been inaugurated. So I'm sure there'll be dramatic attempts for the media. We've ferreted out these criminals, these drug dealers, these human traffickers, the worst of the dredges of the illegals. But I think it'll be fought tooth and nail, quite separate from any attempt to secede from the United States.
Well, I agree with you, but there's also going to be some states that are going to fully cooperate with Trump, like Texas. I mean, under Greg Abbott, a Republican there, I think he may try to outdo Trump to rid Texas of every single illegal immigrant. And the same with DeSantis in Florida. And you've got a situation where I think they're going to be encouraging snitches. When I went to Cuba, when I was there visiting with people, they told me that each neighborhood, uh, that the neighborhood block of houses had an official snitch, and his job was to watch the neighborhood for anything out of place and report it to the authorities. And my hunch is that's the way it's going to turn out in some of these states that are cooperating. There's going to be like a hotline. Oh, there's an illegal immigrant working at McDonald's in my neighborhood, or working as a maid or a nanny in my next door neighbor's house. I mean, I saw it when I was in Laredo, which was a border town. Uh, Everybody had an illegal immigrant maid. Not everybody, but most people in the middle class did, and everybody was happy. But when one of those maids got mad at being abused by a housewife, she would move to some other housewife, and if the first housewife learned where she was, she'd pick up the phone and call the Border Patrol and report the maid is, and the Border Patrol would go and pick her up.
I
So
think
I think,
we also have to remember that this is going to have a lot of negative side effects. Okay, Trump may be railing against illegals, but even he has said that there are paths to citizenship, there are paths of entering the United States. What we want are legal immigrants, those who have followed the procedures to enter and live in the United States. So he's not against every person who's ever come here in their own lifetime as an immigrant. He's classifying legal and illegal. But the point is that what happens if in one of these sweeps, a whole bunch of legal immigrants are rounded up and they don't have their papers on them, right? There's image of like, Nazi Germany where the Gestapo show up. We want to see your papers, but they don't have my papers. You're under arrest. I mean, what happens then to legals who get caught in these nets, and the difficulty of demonstrating and proving without a variety of abuses and personal affronts and treatment and undignified treatment that they'll suffer, even when they're in the category that Trump says have a right to be here. And I believe that besides the illegals, that this is going to affect a lot of other innocent bystanders, including legal immigrants under the Trump definition, that's going to leave a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. That's part of this that is still to unfold.
well, we saw that during the Roosevelt administration, Franklin Roosevelt administration, and when they were announcing that any Mexican here who had been here legally, I mean, there had been no problems with uh, semi-open borders up to the 1930s, but suddenly Roosevelt says, "Oh, you're taking the limited jobs from the Great Depression away from Americans," and so they had these raids, like in California, on public parks, and they would sweep up American citizens and they would deport them because they looked like Mexican Americans. They were Mexicans. They couldn't tell the difference. So
Right.
they just round them all up, and there were a lot of Americans deported to Mexico that were of Mexican descent during that period.
Yeah. So this will be, and the media, of course, will pick up these cases, and it will make the Trump administration look bad among even some of the people who support they count on, including in the Latin American community in the United States. It's true that Trump got a larger proportion of the Hispanic votes than historically has been the case for the Republicans in the past. But once some legals get rounded up and harassed and thrown into the jail, either deported or languishing in some federal jail until their papers are presented, is going to cause a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths in the very segment of the population that helped bring Trump to power.
Well, I know we're about out of time, but you mentioned something there about how many Hispanics supported Trump, but I think part of the reason for that is a big part of the reason is because of the massive disorder that this system has produced along the border. And people get so tired of the disorder, the massive disorder along the border that comes from this system of immigration controls, that they look for the man on the white horse. That Trump's going to establish law and order. He's going to make this system work once and for all, and they're willing to trade away liberty for the ostensible purpose of security. But I think they're going to find that they don't get either one in either of these systems. In any event, Richard, I hope that Holman isn't referring to people like you and me who will be speaking out against the injustices involved here in terms of suffering the consequences of getting in his way.
Oh yes, I'm sure that those people who speak out against these policies, whether they be liberals in the modern sense of liberal or conservatives, there will be some conservatives who will be upset about the harshness of the methods, and then classical liberals or libertarians like ourselves who question the principle of it. I'm sure that they'll set some high profile examples to sort of try to get others to be quiet in the criticisms and the arguments against.
Okay, on that note, we'll wrap things up. We're out of time. Thank you all for tuning in. Again, you'll be receiving our end of year fundraising letter either through print or email. We would greatly appreciate you giving us your positive consideration for the work that we're going to be doing in the year ahead, advancing the principal case for liberty as we've done for some 35 years now here at FFF, and I want to thank y'all for getting us through 35 years. We're very, very honored and very, very grateful. Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.